Okay, welcome and greetings. This is the MSDynamicsWorld.com Fall Inventory Management webcast series. I'm Jason Gumpert. I'm really happy to welcome you all to today's event. We're fortunate to be joined today by Howard Coleman of MCA Associates, a true inventory and supply chain expert in the wholesale distributor and manufacturing industries. I hope you are all really excited for a great session today. Howard will be taking questions at the end, and feel free to utilize the chat and Q&A blocks that you see to the right side of the screen there anytime to get your questions in. And we'll also be tweeting today. We'll be using the hashtag MSDWinventory to track some of the discussion. So feel free to track us there too and add your comments and questions. So without further delay, please allow me to hand things off to Howard Coleman.
Well, thank you very much, Jason, and welcome to all. Appreciate you joining us today. Just a little background. Again, my name is Howard Coleman. I'm the principal of MCA Associates. We've been a management consulting firm since 1986, and a leader, we believe, in lean thinking. We work with primarily wholesale distributors and manufacturing companies that are seeking and committed to operational excellence. Today, our topic is the future of inventory and supply chain management for wholesale distributors and what we think are some of the changes in thinking that are required. You know, I always say, and I've said this for many years, regardless of who you are and the size of your company, I believe that supply chain is supply chain regardless of who you are. So our objective today is to challenge your thinking, understand what others have done, and how they re-examined the individual issues and viewpoints that have existed between them and their suppliers. We hope that our session today allows you to overcome some of the hesitation about changing your thinking. And overall, we want to accelerate the timeline towards the adoption of some new DNA in our supply chain thinking. Now, can I expect that today there's going to be full buy-in, or that as soon as you hang up, you're going to embark on some significant initiative? Probably not. The best I can expect, I think, is that I will be effective in introducing some ways to improve the flow of product within your supply chains, as well as provide enough specifics within the time constraints that we have today that suggest that there is an opportunity for significant improvement. So I hope at the end of our presentation today, your gut feeling or your common sense will scream out to you that what we've discussed is in fact worthwhile, even if your head, at least for a while, kind of resists a new reality. So our agenda today is discuss two competing supply chain models. One is called push, the other is called pull, and what's different about them, how we go about using them. We want to take some time to discuss some basic pull principles. We want to discuss the effects on your inventory and supply chain management capabilities and the effect on your suppliers and how we might go about developing some very real collaborative supplier relationships. Now, if any of you have had the opportunity to read any of my articles that typically appear in various industry publications and websites, then you probably already know that I'm very much an advocate of lean thinking, and it's a philosophy. That is, driving waste out of our processes. So, wouldn't it be nice to be able to live one of the tenets of lean thinking, and that is only make if you happen to be a supplier, or buy, if you're a distributor, what is consumed by the customer at the rate of their requirement. In other words, reacting to the drumbeat of the customer, and let that drumbeat trigger the pace for the rest of the supply chain. Now, I think that's a pretty common sense statement, but we also know there is no such place as utopia or perfection. But it shouldn't keep us from considering a change in thinking, maybe even challenging some of the mental models that exist. Things like economies of scale and replacing them with economies of time. You know, our inventory investments are important to us. Now, if you happen to be turning inventory 3 or 4 times a year, isn't that like getting a paycheck every 90 to 120 days? Well, I'll tell you, I don't know anyone who would want to get a paycheck, including myself, that infrequently. Yet wholesale distributors have accepted that as a result, literally for generations. Yes, maybe some get more, some a little less, but I can also tell you from our experience, some accept a lot less. Frankly, I don't understand why this is acceptable in an era where profits, cash flow, and competitive advantage are such critical success factors. So in trying to improve, you know, we can add more complexity or we can change reality. Because unless the reality is changed, there's no reason to expect that all the hard work that we do is going to produce any different results. So I think some good reasons to consider more radical change and listen to and consider what other companies have embraced. You know, I think there are certain assumptions that have been built into the fabric of our organizations and their suppliers. So I guess I need to begin to tell you that I've developed a few serious concerns about companies being acceptant of incremental change. First, I think there's all the confusion that is sometimes created by all the experts who seem to be stuck in the push world. Well, what's the push world? Well, it's those folks still stuck in the 90s or earlier. It's the ROP and the EOQ and the min-max world who continues to suggest that better forecasting, more accurate forecasting, and warmed over inventory management concepts are still the way, are the best practice, if you will, in wholesale distribution and supply chain management. And you know what's commonly advocated? You know, we generate a replenishment order, whether we call it a purchase order or a stock transfer, if you happen to be in a multi-location environment. They're typically based on a forecast and a calculation of when product will be needed in the future. It's based on inventory balances, lead time, and safety factors. And then we tend to push that product downstream from the suppliers through our distribution centers to all our branch locations. My second concern is what seems to be a desire to maintain the status quo, optimize the old rules, remain prisoners of and chained to our own thinking, rejecting what appears to be counterintuitive or contrary to mainstream thinking. Just maybe it's a disturbing lack of open-mindedness to new concepts in the distribution supply chain management playbook, most of which, by the way, are receiving wider acceptance in the distribution world, whether you are in wholesale distribution, retailing, or manufacturing. Remember, they have to distribute too. A good example, I think, is freight savings. You know, freight savings goes directly to profitability improvement, but what does it do? It encourages more emphasis on reducing freight costs even more. And maybe we do that by ordering more. But those are tactics focused on narrow individual considerations, what I often call disconnected optimizational silos. Because while the purchase unit cost might be low, the decision to buy may turn out to be very much more costly in the long run. Because we have to have valuable space to store product, we have to monitor and control the inventory, we have to cycle count that inventory, and along the way we know some obsolescence or shrinkage tends to creep in. So what happens is the total cost gets completely lost in the financial picture, what I like to call the total cost of ownership. You know, there are 3, maybe 4 basic questions that most wholesale distributors continue to ask and have been for many years. How much do I order from vendors? How much do I keep upstream at a central distribution center or main warehouse? How much do I keep downstream at a branch? And more of them are starting to ask, how do I go about improving my supplier collaboration? Now, years ago, our systems, in particular our ERP systems, evolved beyond those days of where we had fixed reorder points and fixed reorder quantities. I don't know if you're old enough to remember that. I do. But the breakthrough occurred back in the 1990s, and it was described in a book called Distribution Inventory Management for the 1990s. And it was written by Gordon Graham. And this fellow sold a lot of books. It was a great book at the time. Software developers kind of latched onto the concepts as the primary engine in their ERP systems. And I have to admit it was an improvement. And to a large extent, though, the concepts have remained essentially unchanged. In practice, it encouraged us to rely on demand forecasts to drive inventory planning and reordering. It asked us to use safety stock inventory to mitigate variability in forecasts and lead times. Yes, the results were better, but still resulted in what I believe was more inventory than you actually needed immediately. By focusing on how much inventory we have, we sort of sacrificed the focus about where inventory should be, particularly in terms of the distribution center and branch warehouse inventory replenishment relationships, and how wholesale distributors go about ordering product from suppliers, and how those suppliers react. You know, I always preface my comments when I give this presentation or similar by pretty quickly showing you this picture, because I think this picture is worth 1,000 words. On the left side, we see the results of a push supply chain model. On the right side, we see the results of a pull, P-U-L-L, supply chain model. And it represents the inventory in your supply chain. Now, immediately, you're going to recognize that the inventory peaks are much lower on the right side. And, in fact, the lows are a little higher. The intervals between the peaks are much shorter. And surely, as you can see, there's less inventory on average, right? Now, to get to this pull picture, it's going to mean focusing our efforts on lead times, safety stock, reducing inventory replenishment cycles, reducing our order quantities. In other words, these are your inventory drivers. In fact, these are the constraints that we need to recognize as barriers to improvement. So we're going to discuss this distinction or differences between these two alternative supply chain models, push versus pull, and the benefits I believe can be achieved by adopting a lean thinking, pull-based supply chain model that aligns your resources as close as possible to actual customer demand, while at the same time providing more visibility to the inventory requirements and its status across the whole supply chain. There are certain outcomes, there are certain outcomes that we're going to be looking for here. We want to be able to hold the right amount of inventory at the right place in the supply chain. We want to promote inventory flow while minimizing our working capital. We want to be able to size and dynamically adjust stock positions by focusing on these inventory drivers. We want to reduce the emphasis on that elusive goal of forecast accuracy. Instead, maybe demand is driven almost entirely by actual customer demand. I like to call this the customer's buy signal. And then be able to foster a new collaboration approach with our manufacturers, with our manufacturers and suppliers. In other words, sharing these buy signals. So these are just a few of the outcomes we're seeking. The benefits of these concepts have been amply demonstrated in several industries. The problem is that often many companies and suppliers think they're a lot different, as opposed to thinking supply chain is supply chain, no matter who you are. And as a result, they settle for this incremental improvement, not learning from the new chapters that have been written, and not accelerating the timeline for adoption. You know, the challenge of our supply chains can often be very daunting, and particularly if we happen to be in a multi-echelon distribution network where you have products stored in a distribution center, and that distribution center is the internal supply to your branches. In other words, your customer-facing locations. And we typically call this a hub-and-spoke distribution model. But what seems a natural tendency here is to keep inventory as close to the customer as possible, because if a product is not close to the customer or the point of consumption, the smaller the chance of a sale, right? Well, not exactly. That's always seemed to make a lot of sense to us, though. But it's what I call push behavior. And of course, what do we rely on to accomplish this is a good forecasting model in order to predict what location will need what inventory and when. A hub-and-spoke distribution network works well, but can have some major pitfalls because each of these echelons of inventory have their own inventory drivers. So we could call it a lack of true network optimization because stocking and replenishment strategies are often applied to one echelon without regard to the other. They all have their own drivers. Now, this reliance on demand forecasting and this inherent variability in forecasting can have some very potential negative consequences. Out-of-sync relationships between what you order versus the actual demand you are experiencing. Excess inventory in the form of redundant safety stocks, because we keep safety stocks at both the hub and the spokes. Sometimes stockouts occur at a spoke, even though plenty of inventory exists somewhere else in the distribution network. And replenishment decisions between the distribution center and its supplier often use order strategies that depend on, or at least are influenced by the supplier's ordering constraints. These have to do with pricing, discounts, freight allowances, purchasing rebates, etc. And because of this demand variability that we experience in our forecasts, we often see these whipsaw, seesaw, sometimes I call them ripple and snowballing effects. It's the impacts of forecast variance. And by the way, this very same picture can depict the impact on your suppliers when they get orders from you. Your suppliers use your purchase orders generated based on your forecast to plan their production and their capacity levels. Any demand variability you experience often is not immediately communicated to them, maybe not until the next purchase order when things start to catch up, or maybe the one after that. So they experience some of this whipsaw effect too. It's really kind of a brittle supply chain. So I contend there are some real facts of life to consider, and maybe we should just challenge them. Now consider this statement. The lower the level of aggregation, the worse the answer becomes. Let me say that again. The lower the level of aggregation, the worse the answer becomes. And what you see in this slide is just a statistical truth. The numbers you see at the distribution center and each of these branches, the number to the left of the slash is the forecast, the number to the right is actual demand. You can see at the branches there's some significant variance amongst the branches, yet when you aggregate all those numbers at the branches and aggregate it up to the distribution center, the variance doesn't look anywhere as bad as it does at each individual branch. So the question of how much demand I will incur, for instance, at the distribution center level, typically provides a better answer than answering the question, how much will I sell of that product from a specific location? But what do we typically do? We address these symptoms of variance. We address this truth by overcompensating with inventory, particularly at branch locations, and exactly where the forecast variance is highest, ending up with that dreaded safety stock. And of course, from a service level perspective, the possibility that product is going to be misallocated. In other words, we're going to send product to the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, I'm not suggesting you don't forecast anymore. There are plenty of good reasons to forecast. But have you ever measured your forecast accuracy? I would bet that your accuracy never gets beyond 70 to 80%. Looked at it a different way, that's 20 to 30% error. In most companies, accuracy remains a pretty elusive goal. So some would say, well, if we can only develop better forecasting algorithms, or better use the ones we have to make intelligent decisions, then we have the answer to the right quantity of the right item to the right location at the right time, right? No, not really. So in response, companies try to improve their systems and processes for forecasting and inventory replenishment planning. And I can tell you some have spent a lot of time and money on it, with pretty extensive enterprise resource planning systems in place to translate forecasts into product distribution plans, all the while attempting to optimize their transportation costs, their customer service, their warehouse capacity, their inventory dollars and turns. But why do we still hear complaints about forecast accuracy? Why do we still hear complaints about misallocation of product? And very importantly, why do so many wholesale distributors still achieve mediocre inventory trends? So if, in fact, we can agree here right now at some level that forecasting itself is a constraint, then why not exploit that constraint? So as a way of thinking differently, let's consider this pull methodology and think of it this way. And I'm going to use a grocery store example here. Think of it this way. The grocer replaces stock on the shelves as product is actually bought by the customer. In other words, as product is sold, a replacement is pulled throughout the supply chain. But we're doing it now based on real demand, that actual consumption, that customer's buy signal. Now, I'm not suggesting we replenish inventory at your company locations based on every time we sell one, we have to buy one. Or if you're a manufacturer, every time you sell a product, you have to make one. But what if we could move in that direction, and by doing so, foster a continuous flow of product and increase the velocity and throughput of the supply chain? You know, we use these buy signals I'm talking about in our everyday life. Now, a good example is a gas gauge, isn't it? Now, without this signal, we would have to guess our usage of fuel, possibly finding ourselves running out of gas or wasting a lot of time, our resources, by filling up at the gas tank too often. Now, just like a pull system, the gas gauge usually has some left in the tank. That is, there's some inventory left in the tank. But its purpose, its real purpose, is to tell us the actual consumption and the urgency of inventory replenishment need. So, could we procure inventory based on what the customer actually consumes, those buy signals, leading to smaller buy quantities, lower inventory, and more frequent replenishment, and making forecast variance less of an issue? So hopefully you're already seeing some of the differences here and, more importantly, the road that I'm heading down. Buying or manufacturing inventory based on anticipated demand, your forecast, can lead to high inventories, those high peaks, those long intervals in between replenishments that I attempted to show in that picture worth 1,000 words. And if we happen to encounter, by the way, any inventory problems along the way, as we surely will, maybe we could drive inventory problem resolution through some visual controls or gauges, just like our gas gauge. So, if we took this different perspective to reaching our ultimate objectives and those outcomes that I described earlier, reducing reorder quantities and increasing replenishment frequency, ultimately reducing that dreaded safety stock need because our exposure to stockouts is less. Well, how would we go about it? Well, this is the time where we're going to move forward and talk about some future practices. But there are some very specific focuses here, which are all linked, which come under the banner, if you will, of basic pull principles. And I just want to take the time to review those with you. Forecast accuracy and stability can be improved by aggregating your demand across the warehouses. In other words, using the DC level forecast for planning and concentrating what I call buffer inventory, and we'll explain that in a few minutes, and concentrating that inventory at the DC, at the distribution center point. The variation in demand at the DC is typically less than it is at the branches. Now, one of the most radical departures from existing norms, and a critical transition here, is to pull inventory back from the branches. Now, don't get excited. I know it's scary, isn't it? No, and I'm not talking about pulling back all the inventory. But again, keep in mind that forecast variance is highest at the branches. It's just that statistical truth. Strategic inventory positioning, therefore, becomes pretty important. So why not move more safety stock to the DC, where it can best protect the whole distribution network? Inventory levels should be a function of replenishment time and frequency. Focus on reducing the lead times and increasing the frequency of replenishment, the resupply. Those are your inventory drivers. As the frequency increases, the more you will be driven by actual demand. Put another way, using pull initiates replenishments closer to the actual quantities that were actually sold and shipped to customers. Allow pull to create a replenishment stream, a continuous flow of inventory to stocking locations. Increasing the frequency of replenishment increases the speed and the velocity of the supply chain. In other words, it increases throughput. Now we're going to go over two other principles which are kind of going to move us into some new territory. The first one is developing and maintaining appropriate target inventory levels, what earlier I was calling the buffers. We're going to talk about that in a few moments. And secondly, we want to develop new kinds of relationships with suppliers that incorporate this pull model. Now, this target inventory I'm talking about, this buffer inventory, is simply the amount of inventory you shoot for in the supply chain. It's your on hand, it's your on order, and what might be in transit to you. Now, I bet your current software already computes some form of target inventory. You know, maybe it's simply a number of weeks supply, maybe it's a goal for inventory turns, or maybe it's based on some other fixed parameters you may have set. But typically, it's taking the usage times the lead time plus some safety stock component. Again, those inventory drivers that we've been talking about. What if we could manage the appropriate target inventory level? What if we could manage the appropriate buffer inventory made up of these inventory drivers and begin recognizing those target inventories that consistently demonstrate too much, too little, or just enough overall inventory protection? Then we could use these target inventory levels maybe as actual measures to monitor how well they're being utilized. Maybe then we could even use them as signals to the product source, your DC or your supplier, as to what the priority and urgency of the product need is. Again, kind of like that gas gauge. As an approach, and this is only as an example, we could initially split these target inventory levels into three zones. Let's just call it simply green, yellow, and red, just like a traffic light. And we set rules as to what constitutes various levels of target inventory level penetration. For instance, too many products in the green zone may mean inventories are too high relative to actual customer consumption. On the opposite side, too many products in the red zone may mean you have problems with inventory replenishment timing, or maybe higher or unusual customer consumption. Let's go through a couple of simple examples. Very simply, our target inventory level, that's our TIL, for a product is 100 units, and currently at the location we have 40 units. Now, realistically, we would expect 60 or more units to be on the way from us, from wherever we get it from, whether that's the distribution center or directly from the supplier. Our target inventory penetration, therefore, is at 60%. Using those three breakdowns that we showed earlier, this item would be in the yellow zone. Let's take another example. Here our target inventory level for a product is 100 units, and currently at the location we have 20. Well, we should expect 80 more units to be on the way from us, from our source. The target inventory level penetration is 80%. Again, based on the parameters we set, this would put us in the red zone. We're not doing well there. If we took a business intelligence approach, we could even describe this visually over periods of time, where we see in this particular example, inventory is in pretty good shape. It's in the yellow zone, meaning customer requirements are consistently being met. Here we seem to have an ongoing problem. This particular product is almost consistently in the red zone. One final example. Here our targets appear to be too high relative to actual customer consumption. And that's why it's in the green zone. So we're not tracking well there either. It means we have high levels of inventory. So we can now display, if you will, or visualize the information, use it to act quickly, and arrive at the real inventory you need in order to cover actual demand. Now, we could do this at the company location, a company level rather. We could do it at a location level. We could do it at a stock keeping unit level. And maybe we could even do it based on some type of ABC or Pareto analysis level. Further, we can now examine how long a product stays in a zone, and further examine the number of products within a zone. This tells us how well we're managing our buffer inventories and our inventory drivers. By visualizing this information, next question might be is why shouldn't we be able to communicate it? That really brings up another discussion about what the effects are on supplier relationships if we use a pull model. What else can we challenge here? And I have to admit, this is often a very difficult part of the supply chain discussion. There's a lot of people who speak to supplier collaboration, but I think to the point that the term has nearly lost its meaning. Now, if we can agree up to this point that inventory is traditionally pushed to you, and this is the model you use, then it's possible that your suppliers also have not adopted a lean philosophy either. Rather, they're still in that mass production mindset, another one of those disconnected functional silos. And what that says is that the key to reducing their costs is to produce in large batches, spreading their fixed costs over a larger population. In other words, their aim is to reduce their unit costs. But it drives that economy of scale model. And that's how they get measured in many cases. So our suppliers produce in these large batches, potentially consuming capacity with product that may not be immediately needed. And after about 26 years of doing what I do and working with so many wholesale distributors and meeting with their suppliers and vendors, I've seen shortages of product that occur at the supplier because they were too busy making something else. But by the same token, there are many manufacturers out there that have become lean advocates a lot longer than most wholesale distributors have. Now, this break in conventional wisdom for some manufacturers came through taking some lean thinking approaches to reducing their production batch sizes and their production cycle times. In reality, then, only the terminology is different in distribution. Order quantities and replenishment frequency interval now replace what manufacturers always called production batch sizes and production cycle times, respectively. Really the same thing. Many have made a complete turn in the conventional wisdom. That is, planning and execution now is based on actual consumption of product or material. They've established target inventory as a means To buffer the uncertainty, they have focused on the bottlenecks to optimize their production and inventory drivers, and they modify those drivers when necessary. Unfortunately, in wholesale distribution, we seem to hear little discussion about this. So what if we could begin to share this consumption data, these pull signals? I have to tell you, this is already occurring. If you're familiar with vendor-managed inventory or VMI programs, I see a lot of it in the electrical distribution industry. There are many VMI programs out there that often are undertaken for this very purpose, to share actual consumption data with your supplier. Now think about this. Distributors and suppliers each could foster the opportunity to share actual consumption data, helping each other to order or produce less, allow your supplier to smooth out their production, reduce work in process inventory, and maybe even decrease their lead times. In other words, foster a continuous flow, provide more velocity in the supply chain. So I think the possibility of a direct data connection, if you will, between you and your suppliers to communicate these pull signals is intriguing and very compelling, because you have to have aligned interests if you're going to collaborate with your suppliers. There has to be a win-win, and I think that could be a positive development. At the very least, it suggests a more strategic collaboration. So I think we have the potential to get our suppliers to think differently also. The content of the discussions that we need to have with suppliers, very frankly, is probably left for another webinar, but surely entails a requirement and a necessity of being able to have the knowledge to outline and explain, to make yourself understood, understand the concepts, and the value proposition and the expected outcomes resulting, or that could result, in your communications with your suppliers. So where we initially described push as this, if you recall, about the third or fourth slide, that is pushing inventory at every level. I think now we can describe pull in a completely different light, more as a system in a lean thinking process, which has as its attributes the development of target inventory levels, those buffers against uncertainty, increasing your replenishment cycles, taking a pull approach to replenishing your customer-facing locations, taking the opportunity to look at your inventory drivers like lead time and order sizes, and beginning to look at how you go about replenishing in terms of what the total cost is. So we can look at it as an engine for supply chain management and collaboration for the future. Why? Because now we're exploiting the constraints, the bottlenecks, the constraints of forecast, the constraints of order frequency, the constraints of safety stock. That's what impacts your inventory. It's what drives your inventory. Now, in focusing our efforts there, what's the expected outcome? Well, the outcome should be that actual demand drives your immediate replenishment needs, and that demand will more approximate actual usage. So the challenges we face here are really, I believe, a challenge or a change in thinking. And, of course, any change in thinking is often a real reason for hesitation, isn't it? I think it's time to move away from those old Gordon Graham distribution for the 1990s inventory management methods. The addiction to inventory, the total reliance on forecast accuracy, and the mediocre inventory turns that typically result. And as I said earlier, that wholesale distributors for too long seem to be acceptant of. whole brings the concept of total cost of ownership to the forefront. Now, if your reaction to all of this is a concern about transportation costs or labor costs, then at some point you have to go and do a cost analysis. Using the methods that we've described above, you will find a trade-off point, a total cost approach that provides better results than what you've obtained previously. But I can tell you, and trust me on this, it won't be easy because your own mindset will have to change first, and you will have some issues, I guarantee you, with some employees or even suppliers who need to think differently too. Now notice also, we haven't talked about this subject necessarily as a technology issue. There is some technology involved, obviously, but it's really not a technology project. It's really about the processes and the strategies we use. In other words, it's a business improvement project. It's about competitiveness and your company's ability to manage its resources and supplier relationships, its impact on profits, cash flow, service, and competitive advantage. So I urge you to look at what others have done. Take advantage of the advances that have already been made. And I'll tell you, there's surely nothing wrong with looking outside your own industry. Ultimately, each organization is going to have to ask itself, what adds value to my supply chain or only cost to what I do? Will my supply chain be a source of real business value and competitive advantage to my company, or just purely another operational function within the company? Now, right now, relatively few distributors and suppliers really understand this particular lean thinking concept and what the implications are. But I believe within a few years, more certainly will, and they're going to be on their way to their own change in thinking. So finally ask yourself, what should I be doing now about my supply chain, my collaboration with suppliers, and my competitive advantage agenda? In other words, my supply chain versus my competitor's supply chain. You see, I suggest that's your real call to action. I'd like to thank you very much for attending. It looks like pretty much everyone stayed, which we appreciate. I'd like to take this opportunity to offer you an opportunity to go to our website at mcaassociates.com or email me directly. We have several articles and white papers related to this subject. In particular, there's a new one. It's not even on the website yet. It's called Do Wholesale Distributors Really Need Better Forecasting? To get it, please just email me at the address that you see on the slide, and I'll be more than happy to forward that along to you. If you have any questions, you need additional clarification, I realize we only had about 45 minutes today. Feel free to contact me, and if you want to set up a call, I'd be more than happy to spend some time chatting with you on this particular subject. I'll guarantee you there's no sales pitch. This is just something I love to talk about, and I'd be more than happy to do that with you. Again, thank you very much.
All right, Howard, thanks so much. And Howard, do you have time for questions now, or should we leave it at the contact information there?
No, I'm open to answering any questions. I think we still have some time available.
Yeah, so if you do have a question for Howard, feel free to enter it into the chat window that you see, the chat block you see on the right of the screen, or in the Q&A block, and we'd be happy to get to a few of those as time permits. Howard, one question that I actually had, in terms of getting enough decision makers at your organization to actually change their thinking, if you're, let's say, a champion and believer in lean inventory, what are some of the steps that you might need to take to actually sell the concept internally? Are there particular metrics or particular questions you should be asking in your experience?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say there, Jason, is that these type of concepts and functions, if you will, usually fall within the domain of whether we call the person a purchasing manager or an inventory manager or a supply chain manager or whatever. That person has to be well-versed, if you will, in the concept of pull in terms of what the methodologies are, what the implications are. And I say that because supply chain management has changed so drastically over the course of the past few years, actually, in terms that we expect a lot more from our supply chain managers than we did in the past, where they were basically order placers. So there's a major change there in terms of what the functionalities are and what the expertise is that we expect from a supply chain manager. So I think the initiative, if you will, kind of starts there. And what I've seen through a lot of my clients who have begun to latch on to this, if you will, is that the corporate supply chain manager is the one that begins to spread the word upwards, if you will, to senior level people in terms of what the potential outcomes are for their company by beginning to focus on these inventory drivers and taking a different approach than just customarily relying on forecasts. It's like every project in almost any company that's not necessarily initiated by the president. It has to be sold up. And good supply chain managers have the capability of doing that because they're usually able to demonstrate some very significant benefits in terms of what the impact is, particularly on profitability and on cash flow, which is always a very important issue for most business owners, and particularly in this world today. And that's what normally gets their, an owner or a senior manager's attention are those types of metrics and what the positive impact could be. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely, and we have a couple others here that I want to get to. Just a point of information first, if you didn't catch the full session today, it is being recorded, and we will be putting it online and sending out an update when that is available. So thanks for asking that. A couple other things that have come in here. One is, let me see if I can combine a couple, but how do you deal with vendors with high MOQs and long lead times, and are there other specific KPIs you would track?
Well, one of the questions that always comes up relative to suppliers are the issues related to what you call MOQs, minimum order quantity criteria, and that's it's not an easy issue to resolve. Requires a lot of conversation with vendors. If you recall in the presentation, I said that's probably the subject of another webinar somewhere down the line. It's something I need to address because it is such a difficult conversation. But the point that has to be made in those conversations with vendors is that there is an alignment of interest here in terms of how they operate, in terms of their own production capacities. These minimum order quantities cause us to generate larger orders than what we probably need just to meet those minimums. And the impact, as we showed on some of the slides, was that vendors receive these large lumps of orders, most of which is not necessarily today, tomorrow, next week, or the week after that, but it's forced to them by virtue of the transportation issues. Somewhere in the middle, there's a solution, if you will. It's a little bit different often with each vendor. Some of my clients who have begun these type of discussions, again, are using the argument that by collaborating this way and us being able to provide you with what our actual consumption is, that you as a manufacturer are going to be able to do better in your own internal operations in terms of reducing your work in process, having less stockouts on the supplier side, and be able to maybe even reduce lead times because we don't have to produce 10,000 of something when really all we need is 5,000 of something within the next couple of weeks. So it's a little bit different with each vendor, I'm not ignoring the issue here of these minimum order quantities because it just crops up everywhere. It's become part of the DNA of the way you do business. Wholesale distributors and their suppliers have been pretty slow to react to these things. You go into other industries beyond some of the industrial distribution verticals, and you'll see that there's been a lot more cooperation in the consumer products area, for instance, even in the high technology product area, where they're both sides, the distributor or the ultimate seller to the consumer and their suppliers are really looking at those advantages of increasing the flow of product, reducing the inventory, and focusing on those inventory drivers. So again, I hope that's that kind of gives somebody a better idea, but it's not an easy subject to deal with. My other point in raising that conversation with your supplier, often a mistake I often see is a supply chain manager talking to their salesman about it or their manufacturer's rep about it, and that's a big mistake because those people are salespeople and they don't want to hear anything about reducing order quantities. So the best thing is to go to a peer, if you will, at your supplier, the supply chain manager there or the production manager there. They usually have a better appreciation and are more open to that type of conversation.
All right. Another question that came in here, we do have a couple more, but let me try to sort of paraphrase this one. What is considered to be the most common hurdle to overcome in order to move to a pull environment?
Well, as I indicated, I think more than once, it's the mindset. Most wholesale distributors in industrial distribution, in particular, are still stuck in that mindset of the 1990s, where everything is based on forecasts. Even though we know there's a lot of forecast error, as some distributors have become larger and as a result have opened up more branches, it just exponentially increases the problem because now you've got to have product in different places, so there's more individual forecasts needed at each location. And as we described, at those branch locations is exactly where the forecast variance is highest. But the biggest issue really has to do with changing the mindset. And one of the things that I often suggest is to pilot. Try it on a few products, few product lines, whatever it is you feel you can manage differently from what you normally do. And in almost all situations, we've been able to see some significant improvement, which has allowed that company to expand the pilot, if you will.
Okay. One last question here that we have in the queue. How can sales forecasts be utilized in ERP and Dynamics ERP specifically for our audience when you're considering your reorder levels?
I never meant to indicate that we should be. In fact, I think I said at some point in the presentation that I'm not telling you not to forecast anymore. And surely there's need to forecast if it's nothing more than just for general business level forecasts, or we have some products that require forecasts when they're new products and we're ramping up. Those require forecasts because there's no actual history involved. We have seasonality issues where forecasts or demand has to be prognosticated over peak periods of time versus what's happened in the past. So, we always start off with a forecast. The question is once we have the forecast and we recognize that maybe there's 20 or 30% error in the forecast, what's the best way to buffer that variance? And if by reducing order quantities, increasing replenishment order frequency, reducing safety stock levels, that will in fact begin to allow us to approximate, order something a lot closer to what customers are buying as opposed to what the original forecast was.
All right. Well, we're at the end of our question queue. We're near the top of the hour here, so I think we can wrap up. And Howard, I just want to thank you again for your time today. Great presentation, really informative stuff. And thanks to the audience as well for attending. And that will conclude the presentation.